Darren Adams sat in his office, staring at the latest customer complaints. His stomach twisted. He had spent the last 8 years turning this struggling fast food chain into a thriving business after buying it from a failing owner. But the reports he was reading now told a different story. Long wait times, rude employees, orders constantly wrong, and worst of all, a few complaints about a manager mistreating his staff. Darren ran a hand through his short brown hair, exhaling slowly. He had built this company from the ground up. He wasn't some distant CEO sitting in a high-rise office, disconnected from reality. He had worked the grills, cleaned the floors, and taken orders himself. If something was wrong, he needed to see it with his own eyes. His district manager, Rachel, had assured him everything was mostly fine. But Darren didn't believe in mostly fine. He made his decision. He was going undercover. This wasn't his first time doing something like this, but it had been years since he had last worked the front lines. He would pose as a new trainee at one of his 12 locations, a store that had been getting the most complaints. With a fake beard, dyed darker hair, and a pair of thick-rimmed glasses, no one would recognize him. Especially since most of the staff had never met him in person. Darren had always let his district managers and store managers handle daily operations. He had done a few company-wide video calls before, but he knew that in a corporate chain like his, most employees wouldn't recognize the owner if he stood right in front of them. That was exactly what he needed. The moment Darren stepped into the restaurant, he knew something was off. It was lunch rush, and yet half the staff seemed to be moving sluggishly, barely keeping up with orders. The dining area had trays stacked on tables, trash overflowing. The soda machine was out of ice, and no one seemed to care. A heavy-set man in his late 40s stood behind the counter, arms crossed, watching the chaos with a bored expression. His name tag read, Kevin Store Manager. Darren approached the counter. "You the new trainee?" Kevin barely looked at him. "Yeah," Darren said, adjusting his glasses. "Derek." He had chosen a fake name just in case. Kevin sighed like Darren had already annoyed him. "Great. We're short-staffed, so don't expect much training. Just follow people around and don't screw up." Darren kept his expression neutral. "Got it." A young man, probably no older than 19, was working the fry station. His uniform was a little too big, his brown hair messy and damp with sweat. He moved fast, trying to keep up with the orders. Kevin turned to the kid and snapped, "Hudson, hurry up. You're moving like a damn snail." Hudson flinched but didn't say anything. He just worked faster. Darren frowned. He had worked in fast food before. He knew the difference between someone being slow and someone being overworked. And Hudson was definitely the latter. "Hudson," Darren said, keeping his voice casual, "you've been here a while." 3 months, Hudson muttered. "I like the job, but..." He hesitated, then just shook his head. Darren didn't push. He had a feeling he'd get his answers soon enough. By the time Darren had been there for 2 hours, he had seen plenty. Half the employees were trying their best, but they were overwhelmed. Kevin did nothing but bark orders and disappear into the back. One of the cashiers, a girl named Emily, had to deal with a furious customer over a wrong order while Kevin just watched from a distance, refusing to step in. But the moment that made Darren's blood boil happened at the fry station. Hudson had been working non-stop, barely taking a break. He reached for a basket of fries, but his hand slipped, causing a batch to spill onto the floor. Kevin stormed over. "You idiot, do you have any brain cells?" Kevin snapped, voice loud enough that customers turned to look. "You're completely worthless. I don't even know why I keep you on the schedule." Hudson's face turned red. He swallowed hard, clearly trying not to react. Darren's hands curled into fists. That was it. He had seen enough. Darren took a slow breath, forcing himself to keep his expression controlled. He had dealt with tough situations in business before, but watching a manager demean an employee in front of customers and staff was beyond unacceptable. Hudson's jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on the floor. He didn't argue back, didn't defend himself, just stood there, absorbing the humiliation. Kevin scoffed, shaking his head. "Clean that up and try not to screw up again." Darren moved before he even thought about it, stepping between them. He crouched down and reached for a rag resting on the counter. "Here, I got it," he said, grabbing a handful of the spilled fries. Kevin frowned. "What are you doing?" "Helping." Darren's voice was calm but firm. Kevin let out a sharp laugh. "That's not your job, rookie. Let Hudson clean up his own mess." Darren didn't respond. He just kept cleaning, and after a second, Hudson knelt down too, silently helping him. The kid's hands moved quickly, but Darren noticed the slight tremble in his fingers. The moment the mess was gone, Hudson mumbled a quiet, "Thanks." Darren gave him a short nod before standing. Kevin was still watching him, arms crossed, like he was trying to figure out what kind of trainee would willingly step in for grunt work. Instead of giving Kevin the satisfaction of an explanation, Darren turned back to the station and focused on the work. He needed to see more before making his move. As the next hour passed, Darren noticed a pattern. The employees were exhausted. The kitchen was running on minimal staff, and yet Kevin barely lifted a finger. He disappeared to the back frequently, sometimes for 20 or 30 minutes at a time. Anytime someone asked for help, he gave vague excuses or told them to figure it out. But the worst part wasn't just Kevin's laziness. It was the way the team had adapted to it. Emily, the cashier, automatically handled customer complaints herself, even when they were aggressive. Hudson worked at a frantic pace, clearly trying to avoid giving Kevin any reason to yell. A cook named Lewis had been working 2 stations at once, flipping burgers while also handling the sandwich prep. Darren couldn't ignore the way the employees stole nervous glances toward the back every time they made a mistake, bracing for Kevin's reaction. It was clear this wasn't a one-time outburst. This was the way things worked here. Darren had seen enough. The moment Kevin stepped out from the back again, Darren approached him. "Hey, can I talk to you for a second?" Kevin raised an eyebrow. "What, you already need a break?" "No, just a quick word in private." Kevin sighed but gestured toward the corner of the kitchen, away from the rest of the staff. Darren followed, keeping his tone neutral. "I've noticed the team struggling," Darren said. "They're clearly short-staffed, and it seems like they're not getting much support." Kevin scoffed. "Yeah, because they're slow. If they worked faster, we wouldn't have these issues." Darren kept his expression unreadable. "You don't think they're overworked?" "They're working the same shifts as always. If they can't handle it, that's their problem." Darren studied Kevin's face. The man wasn't just dismissive, he was entirely uninterested in the well-being of his team. Darren had dealt with bad employees before, but this was different. Kevin wasn't just incompetent, he was actively making things worse. Darren spoke carefully. "I heard what you said to Hudson earlier." Kevin rolled his eyes. "Oh, come on, it's fast food. If they can't handle a little criticism, they shouldn't be here." "That wasn't criticism," Darren said, his voice sharper now. "You called him worthless in front of everyone." Kevin shrugged. "Well, maybe if he stopped messing up, I wouldn't have to." Darren exhaled through his nose, steadying himself. He had heard enough. Before he could say anything else, a voice interrupted them. It was Hudson. He stood a few feet away, looking hesitant but determined. His hands were clenched at his sides. Hudson's voice wavered, but he steadied himself. "I wanted to say something." Kevin turned to him, already looking annoyed. "What now?" Hudson swallowed hard, then squared his shoulders. I work hard, we all do, and you don't help, you just yell. He hesitated, then added, and I'm not worthless. Kevin looked stunned for a second, like he hadn't expected anyone to push back. Then his expression darkened. You know what? Kevin said coldly. If you don't like it here, then quit. I can replace you in a day. Darren took a step forward, his patience gone. No, you won't, Darren said. Kevin turned to him, frowning. What? Darren reached up and pulled off his glasses. Then, with deliberate ease, he ran a hand over his beard, loosening the fake hair. Kevin's face shifted from confusion to horror. Darren met his eyes. Own this company. The kitchen fell silent. Emily, Lewis, and the other employees froze mid-task, eyes wide. Hudson's mouth opened slightly in shock. Kevin took a step back. Wait. Darren didn't let him finish. I've been here all day, watching how you treat these employees, watching how you refuse to help while expecting them to carry the weight of your failures. Kevin's face paled. I didn't know. No, you didn't, and that's the problem. Darren's voice was cold now. You don't lead, you belittle, you don't manage, you abandon, and worst of all, you think these people are disposable. Kevin's mouth opened and closed like he wanted to argue, but nothing came out. Darren didn't give him a chance. You're done, effective immediately. Kevin's face turned red. You can't just. Yes, I can. Darren's voice left no room for argument. Get your things and leave. Kevin stood frozen for a moment, like he still couldn't believe what was happening. Then, without another word, he turned and stormed toward the back. The kitchen was silent. Then slowly, Hudson exhaled, his shoulders sagging in relief. Darren turned to the employees. Things are changing, starting now. He could see the disbelief on their faces, but beneath it, flickering hints of something else. Hope. Darren watched as Kevin disappeared into the back, the air in the kitchen thick with shock. Employees stood frozen at their stations, waiting to see what would happen next. Hudson's gaze flickered between Darren and the others, uncertainty written across his face. Emily wiped her hands on her apron, glancing toward the dining area where customers were still waiting. Darren knew he had to take control immediately. The last thing he wanted was chaos. He turned to the team. I know this is a lot to take in, but I need everyone to focus. We're in the middle of a rush and customers are still expecting their orders. Hudson, stay on fries. Lewis, keep working the grill. Emily, make sure the front counter is covered. I'll be jumping in to help wherever needed. There was a brief hesitation, but then, as if a weight had been lifted, they sprang into action. Darren stepped behind the line, rolling up his sleeves. He hadn't worked a shift like this in years, but muscle memory kicked in fast. He grabbed a spatula and started assembling burgers, keeping pace with Lewis. For the first time since arriving, he saw the team working without the constant tension of Kevin looming over them. Emily handled the front with ease, speaking to customers with a confidence that hadn't been there earlier. Hudson worked at a steady rhythm, no longer glancing over his shoulder in fear of being shouted at. Darren caught Lewis giving him a quick look, like he was still processing everything. You actually own this place? Lewis asked as he flipped a patty. That's right. Lewis shook his head, letting out a breath. Never thought I'd see the day. Darren didn't ask what he meant by that. He already knew. They kept moving, pushing through the rush, and for the first time since stepping into this store, Darren saw something change. Employees weren't just working, they were working together. By the time the lunch rush died down, the kitchen was running smoother than it had all day. Darren took a step back, scanning the team as they wiped down stations and prepped for the next wave. Hudson leaned against the counter, catching his breath. Emily pulled her ponytail tighter, looking over at Darren. What happens now? She asked. Darren set his spatula down. First, I want to hear from all of you. No managers, no filters. I need to know exactly what's been happening here. Emily exchanged a glance with Lewis, who crossed his arms. Hudson hesitated, then spoke first. It's been like this for a while. Kevin never really ran the store, just gave orders and disappeared. If something went wrong, it was always our fault. Lewis nodded. We try to hold things together, but it's hard when the person in charge doesn't care. Schedules were a mess, orders got backed up, and no one felt like they could say anything. Emily added, people quit all the time because of him. He made everyone feel replaceable. Darren listened without interrupting, taking in every word. Hudson glanced down, rubbing his fingers together. I almost quit too. Darren's jaw tightened. Hudson looked up, determination in his voice. But I like this job. Just hated the way he made us feel. Darren nodded. That's changing, starting today. They looked at him, waiting. First, I'm promoting from within. You all know this store better than anyone. I'll be looking at who's ready to step up. Emily's eyes widened slightly. Lewis straightened. Second, I'm reevaluating staffing. No more running a store with half the people needed. You all deserve a team that can actually support each other. Hudson's shoulders relaxed just a little. And third, I'm making sure something like this never happens again. No manager should make employees feel disposable. There was a long pause, then Lewis nodded. Emily's lips pressed together like she was holding back a smile. Hudson exhaled slowly, then stood a little taller. Darren wasn't done yet, but he could already see at the shift. Hope wasn't just flickering anymore. It was taking root. Darren stood in the middle of the kitchen, rolling up his sleeves as he considered his next steps. Kevin was gone, but that was just the beginning. The real work started now. Emily leaned her hip against the counter, watching him closely. Lewis adjusted his apron, waiting for what came next. Hudson wiped his hands on a towel, his posture still uncertain but no longer defeated. Darren had built this company from the ground up, but standing here, he realized just how much trust had been broken, both his trust in his management and the employees' trust in leadership. Fixing it wouldn't happen overnight. He turned to Emily first. She had handled the front counter under pressure, kept things moving, and had clearly stepped up where Kevin had failed. More importantly, she had the respect of her coworkers. How long have you been here? Darren asked her. 2 years, she said. Started part-time in college, but stuck around. I liked the job before it turned into survival mode. Darren nodded. We need a new manager, someone who understands what this place needs. I think you could be that person. Emily's eyebrows lifted. Me? She hesitated, glancing at Lewis and Hudson. I mean, I've seen how bad management can be, but I've never. You've been doing the job already, Darren interrupted. You handled customers, covered for Kevin when he disappeared, and kept things running when no one else would. That's leadership. Lewis clapped her on the shoulder. She's the only reason half of us didn't walk out. Emily let out a breath, her fingers tightening around the towel in her hands. All right, she said slowly. I'll do it, but only if things actually change. I'm not going to be another Kevin. Darren's lips pressed together. You won't have to be. With that settled, he turned to the rest of the team. I need to know what's broken beyond just the management. What else has been holding this place back? Lewis didn't hesitate. Scheduling. People get stuck with back-to-back shifts, no consistency. Some of us barely get a full paycheck, and others are working crazy hours. Hudson added, and we don't get the right supplies half the time. We run out of basic stuff, and Kevin would just tell us to figure it out. Emily crossed her arms. Training too. New hires get thrown in with no real guidance. They either sink or swim. Darren absorbed everything they said. These were structural failures, not just the result of one bad manager. It wasn't enough to remove Kevin. If he didn't change the entire system, another Kevin would pop up somewhere else. He made a decision right there. "Here's what's happening immediately," Darren said. "Scheduling is going to be fixed. No more erratic shifts. We're putting in a system that guarantees fairness." Lewis exhaled in relief. Hudson nodded. "I'm also increasing staffing. You shouldn't be running a full lunch rush with half a team. We'll hire more people and make sure they actually get trained." Emily's expression softened slightly, as if she was letting go of a tension she hadn't even realized she was holding. "And pay," Darren continued. "I'm raising starting wages for this location. You all deserve better than just scraping by." That got a reaction. Lewis blinked, then let out a low whistle. Emily looked genuinely shocked. Hudson opened his mouth, then closed it again, as if he wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. "You're serious?" Lewis asked. "Dead serious," Darren said. "And it won't just be this location. I'm going through every one of my stores. If there are other Kevins out there, they're gone. If other employees are struggling like you, we fix it." Emily ran a hand through her hair, exhaling sharply. "This is not what I expected when I walked in today." Hudson finally spoke, voice quieter but steady. "Neither did I." Darren looked around at them, the people who had kept this place running despite everything. They had every reason to be skeptical, but underneath that, he saw something else. Belief. Not in him, necessarily, but in the idea that things could be better. He wasn't going to let them down. Darren stood with his arms crossed, scanning the room as the weight of his decisions settled over the team. The atmosphere had shifted dramatically in just a matter of hours. Where there had been tension and exhaustion, now there was something else: cautious optimism. Lewis adjusted his cap, shaking his head slightly as if he was still processing everything. Emily was already thinking ahead, her fingers tapping against her arm as she considered the responsibilities that came with her new role. Hudson, still standing near the fry station, seemed the most uncertain of all. He had spoken up, but Darren could tell he wasn't convinced that things would actually stay different. Darren knew words weren't enough. The only way to prove things had changed was through action. He turned his focus back to Emily. "We need to talk about the transition," he said. "I want you to step into the manager role immediately, but also don't want you to feel like you're being thrown into the deep end. You'll get proper training, and I'll be working closely with you to make sure you have support." Emily's eyes narrowed slightly. "And what about the rest of the management team? Assistant managers, supervisors, are they staying?" Darren appreciated that she was thinking ahead. The last thing he wanted was for her to inherit a broken structure. "I'll be reviewing everyone's performance at this location," he said. "If there are others who contributed to the problems here, they won't be staying. If there are people who have been trying to do their jobs despite bad leadership, they'll be given the resources to succeed." Lewis let out a low breath. "That's going to shake things up." "It has to," Darren replied. "This isn't about patching holes, it's about rebuilding the foundation." Hudson shifted his weight from foot to foot, still looking hesitant. Darren caught the movement and turned toward him. "You spoke up when it mattered," Darren said. "That's not easy, especially in a job like this where people don't always feel like they have a voice." Hudson glanced at the others before shrugging. "Didn't feel like I had a choice." "That's exactly why it was important," Darren said, "and I want to make sure you don't feel like that again." Hudson's fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. "So, what happens to me?" Darren considered him carefully. Hudson had potential, he had grit, a strong work ethic, and despite everything, he had never given up on the job. Darren wasn't about to let that go unnoticed. "I want you to take on more responsibility," Darren said. "Not as a manager, not yet, but as someone who can help shape the way this place runs. If you're willing, I'd like you to be involved in the training process. Help new hires get the support you never had. Hudson blinked, clearly caught off guard. Me. You know firsthand what went wrong here, Darren said. That makes you the best person to help fix it. Lewis grinned, nudging Hudson with his elbow. Look at you, man, moving up in the world. Hudson still looked skeptical, but there was something else in his expression, too, a flicker of pride. Emily exhaled sharply, running a hand through her hair. All right, if we're doing this, then we need to start making real changes now. Schedules, training, staffing, where do we even begin? Darren didn't hesitate. We start with trust. I need each of you to be honest about what you need to do your jobs right, no holding back. Emily nodded. A real training program, not just throwing people in and hoping they figure it out. Lewis added, more hands in the kitchen. This place runs better when we're not stretched thin. Hudson, after a long pause, finally spoke. Respect, from management, from customers, from the company. Darren met his gaze. That's a promise. Lewis clapped his hands together. Well, guess we've got work to do. Darren nodded, and it starts now.